Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of MEPs for Wildlife. It's fantastic that so many people have registered to hear about why the EU should be closing the loopholes in the EU wildlife trade regulations. My name is Jo Swabe. I work for Humane Society International. That's one of the organizers of this event. And I'm going to be your moderator for today. Before we kick off, please let me do a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, given that there have been more than 300 people who have signed up for this webinar, only the panelists will be able to use their cameras and unmute themselves. Otherwise, it will be complete chaos. Let me also remind the panelists to please turn off their cameras while others are making their presentations, and everyone can switch them back on when we move to the question and answer session. If you would like to ask the speakers and the panelists a question, please use the Q&A button and not the chat. Keep the questions short. Don't forget to add your name and the organization or the institution you represent. And hopefully there'll be some time at the end to ask these questions. We've got a packed program today. So without further ado, I will introduce to you our MEP host for today, Martin Heusig. Martin has been actively involved in nature and animal protection for over 25 years. He has been an MEP for Slovakia since 2019 and is primarily working to avert the climate threat, protect biodiversity and animals, and to regulate hazardous chemicals and promote safe and wholesome food. He's active on 3 of the parliamentary committees. That's the Environment Committee, the Industry, Research and Energy Committee, and Budgets. And more recently, he's been appointed as the Vice Chair of the Animal Transport Inquiry Committee. In the past, he served as a Programme Director for the Animal Protection Organisation 4 Paws, and has also worked for Action Aid and Greenpeace. So Martin, please, we're delighted if you'll now take the floor.
Thank you, Jo. And it's for me really an honor and privilege to be able to host this important webinar. It's really interesting that in these times, the technology is allowing us to meet virtually in a much larger crowd than we would do it probably in a workshop in the premises of the European Parliament. So hopefully this pandemic will be soon over and we will learn lessons from it. But hopefully we'll keep on talking in a wider audiences as well. In recent years, the problem of wildlife trafficking has become a subject of political discussion at the highest level, such as the Council of the EU, but also the United Nations. But the focus is mainly on the charismatic species, tigers, rhinos, elephants, and on trafficking of the species that are internationally protected because they have been listed and the trade regulated under the CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. However, the problem of the wildlife trafficking goes far beyond this. Not all species are protected from exploitation and trade under CITES. And the process of getting individual species listed takes a long time and relies on the proponents for listing, mainly range states, being able to provide a non-detriment findings and made a good case for their listing. Sometimes there's not even yet much scientific know-how and scientific knowledge about the species and the population status, yet these animals are being plundered from their national habitats and sold everywhere, mainly for the exotic pet market. Many species are also nationally protected in their range states, but are not yet listed in the CITES, so their trade is not yet internationally regulated. It may be not legal to catch and trade in the countries under the national legislation, but once they're smuggled out, for example, into the EU, it may be legal to trade in them despite violating the laws of the country of origin. This particularly affects the animals like reptiles and amphibians, which play a vital role in their natural ecosystems, but are often overlooked by the public and do not feature prominently in the campaigns related to the wildlife trade. They may not be the most charismatic, although many of us, I'm sure, are disputing the charismatic. They are charismatic in my view, but they might not be so for the public, but they definitely deserve the protection. At today's event, which MEPs for Wildlife are organizing with Humane Society International and Pro Wildlife, I think it's really organized and important time. Why? Because European Parliament is currently discussing the EU biodiversity strategy, which has been adopted by the Commission last year as a part of the European Green Deal. And this strategy is committed, and the Commission has indeed indicated in its work program that it will revise the EU action plan against wildlife trafficking. But it's also our chance to show that we have learned our lesson from coronavirus outbreak by eliminating the possibility of emergence and spread of zoonotic diseases and preventing the new pandemics. And last but not least, it's a golden opportunity to tackle this form of wildlife crime, because crime it is. Today, you will be hearing more about the EU's role as a hub and a destination for illegally sourced wildlife, and why it's important to acknowledge the wildlife trafficking on a global level as a serious crime. So welcome again, and I'm looking forward to really interesting presentations and very interesting discussions and to questions from you. So back over to you, Joe.
Many thanks, Martin, for your introduction. I mean, it's so good that you've highlighted that this meeting is coming at a time when the issue of biodiversity is right up there at the top of the political agenda. So we couldn't have picked a better day, in fact, to have this event. I'm now going to move on to introduce our two speakers for today. The first presentation is going to be from Dr. Sandra Alteher, who is one of the founders of the German-based charity Pro Wildlife, which is also, of course, one of the co-organizers of this meeting. Sandra is a biologist, and she's been working on wildlife conservation for more than 25 years. Her focus is on wildlife that is threatened specifically by international trade, such as the exotic pet trade, and this work includes active involvement in the CITES process. Recently, Sandra and her colleagues finished a 2-year study for the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation, which analyzed the scope and potential conservation impact of the exotic pet trade in Germany and developing measures for demand reduction. Today, Sandra is going to be speaking about the EU's role as a hub and destination for illegally sourced wildlife. She'll be presenting the findings of Pro Wildlife's recent report, Stolen Wildlife, and yeah, this is basically, we got the title from her reports. So I say, take it away, Sandra. Thank you. You need to unmute yourself, Sandra.
And video. Okay, here we go. Can you hear me? Okay. Yes, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really thrilled that so many people attend this webinar. And as Joe said, my presentation is on the EU's role as a main market for illegally caught pets. And when talking about illegal wildlife trade, we need to distinguish between two groups of animals. The first group is all species which are protected by CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and the correlated EU wildlife trade regulation. And the most known species of that group are whales, tigers, elephants, but when it comes to exotic pet trade, all tortoises, poison dart frogs at this photo, chameleons, primates, parrots, etc. And then we have a second group of animals which is not CITES listed, but is protected in their range states against capture and export. And that's the main issue of my presentation, because this part of illegal wildlife trade is often overseen, and it's at least it's not sufficiently regulated. I start with 3 examples just to show you, to illustrate how it works and what kind of species are targeted. The first example is calotes, the forest lizards, which are native to Southern Asia. And one range state is Sri Lanka, which has a very clear legislation. There are no legal exports of, and all native wildlife is strictly protected. Nevertheless, we have recorded at least 4 calote species during our study on the EU pet trade. which are endemic to Sri Lanka, which means they can only be found in Sri Lanka and no other country. These 3 species are among the 4 I mentioned, and 2 of them are just here shown at this online advertisement by an Italian trader. All of them were, at least during the first time, when they showed up in the pet trade, they were all adult animals, so not offspring, not captive bred. And the 4th species we found is Calotes petijagodai, which is especially interesting because this species was only described scientifically in 2014. It's a new species. It hasn't been known before. And of course, these animals which showed up shortly afterwards in the European pet trade, they didn't fall from a tree. It's pretty clear there are pretty strong indications that these animals were illegally exported from Sri Lanka. The second example is Teratohyla spinosa, which is a wonderful, beautiful, spiny Cochrane frog. It's one of the many glass frogs, and these frogs are especially attractive for pet keepers because their belly is transparent and you can see the internal organs, which makes them extremely interesting to observe. These animals are native to Latin American countries, and I want to focus on Costa Rica because the next case is on Costa Rica. The legislation there is very clear. There are no legal exports for commercial purposes. And then we found this online advertisement by a trader from the Netherlands who offered glass frog farm-bred imports from Costa Rica, so clearly mentions the country of origin. And when we asked the Costa Rican authorities, they just confirmed that there are no commercial breeding farms for these frogs in Costa Rica. Hence, this trader tried to hide the illegal origin of his animals. And although it's not even prohibited so far within the EU, but it was clear that these animals were taken in violation of Costa Rican regulations. After this and other cases, Costa Rica tried to or requested to list all glass frogs in CITES Appendix 2, but this proposal failed at the last COP in 2019. And one problem was the lack of support by the European Union, although we here are a main market for these frogs. The third example I want to show you is the frilled neck lizard, Chlamydosaurus kingii. And this case is especially interesting because there are legally exported animals on the market. The species is native to both New Guinea, which means Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, and Australia. Imports from Indonesia would have been legal because Indonesia has a pretty free policy on exporting its wildlife, but exports from Australia, on the other hand, would be illegal because Australia has a very strict regulation, no exports from native wildlife. But when you look to this Facebook advertisement by a Swedish trader, you see it states, those are not New Guinea dragons and the price is therefore higher. If it's not from New Guinea, it's from Australia, which means that this trader was A, fully aware of what he's doing, and he even justified a higher price because of the illegal origin. I mean, I could continue with giving you examples more and more, but you can find them in our 3 reports, Stolen Wildlife, which we published since 2014, and you can download them at our website. What these reports show is we have a bunch of range states which are targeted by wildlife traffickers of this special form of wildlife crime. And we also have many different species in these reports showing the range of the problem. So what are the conclusions and recommendations of our findings? The first thing is CITES only covers a small range of species in the exotic pet trade. Many reptiles, many amphibians, also ornamental fish, etc. They are not covered by CITES. So the trade is not regulated at all, at least the international trade. Many of the non-CITES species are nevertheless nationally protected, which means that The range states try to protect their animals, but beyond their borders, the protection is finished. Trafficking in such species gains high profit, often at a high level, such as CITES species, but the legal risk is much lower because as soon as these animals are smuggled out of the country, they can be legally imported into, for example, the European Union. They can legally be sold here, possessed, etc. And the EU is a main hub and destination for illegally sourced wildlife. I mean, I showed you traders from different European countries. I'm in Germany, where we have Europe's largest reptile trade show, attracting traders and clients from all over Europe and even beyond. So we know about the special role of Germany and the EU as a hub and a destination. And for all these reasons, we strictly recommend that the EU should pass a legislation like the US Lacey Act, which is a legislation prohibiting the import, sale, and possession of all wildlife which has been illegally sourced in the country of origin. And as Bruce Weisgolds, who worked with the US Fish and Wildlife Service, is part of the panel, I'm sure we will come back on this matter. But for the moment, thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward for your questions and for the debate. Thank you.
Many thanks, Sandra, for your presentation. That's a great overview of what I know have been very detailed reports that you've been able to produce outlining the issue of stolen wildlife. In fact, we have on screen right now one of the photos of some of the species that has actually been found during the research. Yeah, they're definitely going to provide food for thought for this discussion. But for now, we're just going to move to our next speaker. And we're delighted to welcome John Scanlon, who will be addressing the various options on how to establish wildlife trafficking on a global level as a serious offense. Many of you will be familiar with John, since he's served as the Secretary General for CITES from 2010 to 2018, after which he joined African Parks as its first special envoy. He is now the CEO of the Elephant Protection Initiative Foundation. He's also the chair of the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime and the chair of the UK Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund. John holds a Bachelor of Laws and Master of Laws in Environment. And in 2019, he was awarded the prestigious Officer of Order of Australia for distinguished service to wildlife conservation and protection through roles in international organizations. John, the floor is now all yours. Take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Joe. And thank you to Martin and the MEP's Wildlife Group and Pro Wildlife and HAS Europe for organising today's event. It is certainly very timely. And I thank you for inviting me to address the gaps in the international legal framework. We are all experiencing this COVID-19 pandemic together, and it's reminded us, albeit in a devastating way, of the interconnected nature of things, most particularly between economies, the environment, human and wildlife health and welfare. We quite clearly need to recalibrate our relationship with nature, and this observation also applies to wildlife trade, be it legal, illegal, regulated or unregulated. Wildlife issues are not just about conservation, they're also about public and animal health and welfare, and if we get it wrong, it can have massive global implications. The fact that viruses can spill over from certain wild animals to people through wildlife trade, markets and consumption is now very high in our collective consciousness. And late last year, the IPBES told us that there are 1.7 million undiscovered viruses in wild animals, of which about half could spill over to people. Now, we've seen some countries moving ahead to take stricter measures to address these risks, which is great, but to be effective, we need a global response. And these wildlife-related health risks and efforts to combat wildlife crime must be addressed through international cooperation and international laws. So the question is, are our current international laws fit for purpose in a post-COVID-19 world? And the short answer is no, they're not. Our current international regime for regulating wildlife trade and combating wildlife crime, including illegal wildlife trade, is inadequate, both for regulating the trade, markets, and consumption that pose a risk to public health, as well as for ending wildlife crime. They do not reflect the interconnected nature of things, and rather they reflect the siloed approach of the 1970s. Now, I want to firstly very briefly address legal regulated trade. CITES, it's the Global Wildlife Trade Regulator, as Sandra just said, was negotiated and signed back in the early 1970s. And it was designed to address the overexploitation of wildlife through international trade. And it's developed a robust international regime to ensure that trade in listed species does not threaten their survival. It's not perfect, but it does quite well. But CITES was never designed to address the public and animal health aspects of wildlife trade. It addresses the impact of trade on the survival of a listed species at its source, not its potential impacts on human and animal health once taken and transported to other countries. And as Sandra just said, it applies to a limited number of species. CITES' narrow focus on overexploitation was sound when the convention was signed back in 1973, but it cannot be sustained in a post-COVID-19 world. And today we need to take a One Health approach to wildlife trade. And we can do this by adopting amendments to CITES that build public and animal health criteria into its decision-making processes, thereby making CITES a contemporary and relevant convention for a post-COVID-19 world. Now, I'd like to turn my attention to the illegal wildlife trade or illicit wildlife trafficking, which is my primary focus today. And over the past few decades, concerns over wildlife trade have shifted from not just being about overexploitation through trade, but also with illegal trade. These are crimes that deprive governments of revenue, they degrade ecosystems and their ability to sequester carbon, they exacerbate corruption, insecurity, and poverty, and they pose a threat to public and animal health. Illegal trade in CITES listed species is said to be valued at about $20 billion a year. But CITES covers just 38,000 of the world's 8 million species. And if we consider all species, including fish and timber species and other species that are not listed under CITES, that are being trafficked and its impacts on ecosystems, the World Bank puts this figure at a staggering $1 to $2 billion a year. And as more restrictions are placed on wildlife trade, markets, and consumption that could pose a risk to public health, we're going to need to scale up our enforcement efforts to ensure that such trade does not simply move underground. However, notwithstanding these massive and highly destructive crimes, there is no global agreement on wildlife crime, as there is, for example, on human trafficking. Now, CITES has been relied upon. I found this on the web for us. There is fruit sample on human trafficking. Check it out. Sorry, that's just my Siri talking to me. CITES has been heavily relied upon to date, but it was not designed to deal with wildlife crime. It is a trade-related convention, not a crime-related convention. However, in the absence of any other instrument and facing a surge in trafficking, we made the best possible use of it. And we did quite well. And the European Union played a big part in this collective effort, including through its strong support to the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime, known as IQWiC. But we've stretched CITES' mandate to the limit. We need to do more if we are going to win this fight. We need to look to all species being trafficked, not just the species protected under CITES, and to embed combating wildlife crime where it belongs, namely into the international criminal law framework. And we can do this by developing a fourth protocol on wildlife crime under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. The Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, which I chair, has released details on the form and content of a possible new protocol on wildlife crime, as well as answers to frequently asked questions. Now, this draft protocol on wildlife crime sets out a range of commitments to combat and prevent illicit wildlife trafficking. And if adopted, this protocol would embed combating these serious crimes into the international criminal law framework and set out the conduct that is to be criminalized. It would apply to any species of wild fauna and flora, including fish and timber, that is protected under international and, importantly, any national law. And this is what Sandra was just stressing. It would make it a criminal offence to import any wildlife or wildlife product into a country if it had been acquired in contravention of the national laws of the source country. And it would represent a remarkable expression of comity between nations, a mutual respect for one another's laws. And it wouldn't just address the issue of importing, it would address the issue of possessing this once it had been illegally traded. Now, these are the issues that Martin and Sandra were highlighting in their presentations. It would also support raising public awareness of these crimes and demand reduction efforts to help prevent them, as well as sharing information such as on known groups active in illicit trafficking, on their concealment methods, known transport routes, and on sharing forensics, the role and responsibilities of the carriers of contraband, on the verification of documents, and on training and technical assistance. And it would also automatically trigger all of the tools available under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime. Now, if adopted, such a protocol would be the first time that a crime that has a significant impact on the environment is specifically embedded into the international criminal law framework, signifying a powerful and unequivocal acknowledgement by states of the importance of preventing and combating these serious crimes, in recognition of their devastating consequences for wildlife, livelihoods, economies, security, entire ecosystems, including their ability to sequester carbon, as well as to public and animal health, and of the need to seriously scale up our collective response if we want to end them. Colleagues, looked at overall, left out as it is, our system is not going to prevent the next pandemic. Could in fact be raising our potential exposure to zoonotic diseases. CITES was groundbreaking in its day, and our predecessors showed great ambition and courage to negotiate such an agreement into the 1970s. But that was almost 50 years ago. It's now 2021. We live in a post-COVID-19 world. We simply cannot allow a wildlife trade regime to prevail that fails to include public and animal health into its decision-making, nor can we stand by and watch wildlife crimes continue to escalate without scaling up our international response. The youth of this world is taking a massive hit from this pandemic. We owe it to them to pass on a legal framework that is fit for purpose, one that gives us the best chance of avoiding future wildlife-related pandemics and of ending these highly destructive wildlife crimes. And in doing so, we will need to show the same level of ambition and courage as our predecessors did back in the 1970s. And the EU is very well placed to take a lead role in doing so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. You really managed to highlight just where the gaps are in the international framework and exactly why they need closing. I think that a new protocol on, wildlife trafficking under UNTOC would actually be a very good idea. And I really hope that the EU does take a leadership role and get behind this initiative to make the illicit trafficking in protected species a serious crime. I now want to move us to the panel discussion, where all of our speakers will be joined by 4 other experts on the issue of wildlife trade. Can I ask everybody just to, that's on the panel, to put back their cameras on? And John, please put your camera back on as well if you'd like. So, okay, they're all back. Let me introduce them one by one, and then we can turn off the screen share so you can all see them as part of your screen. Our first panelist is Jorge Rodriguez Romero. Jorge is the Deputy Head of Unit for Multilateral Environmental Cooperation at DG Environment for the European Commission. He is primarily responsible for issues relating to the wildlife trade, and one of our main points of contact at the Commission for all things related to CITES. Jorge is joined from Germany by Dr. Mark Aulia. Mark has been working on international wildlife trade issues with a focus on live reptiles and their products for the past 25 years. He has had extensive field experience, particularly in Southeast Asia and more recently in West Africa. He has been at various different CITES meetings and has served as a member and Red List authority of various IUCN specialist groups. And today he actually chairs the IUCN Monitor Lizard Group. Mark is currently affiliated with the Zoological Research Museum, Alexander Koenig, where he's involved in the Folks project. That stands for Forensic Genetics for Species Protection. Our next panelist is Bruce Weiscold, who joins us from across the pond. After working at WWF and Traffic, Bruce worked for the US Fish and Wildlife Service for 25 years, primarily as the CITES policy specialist. And he also represented the United States government and the agency in 18 different countries. Bruce currently works as an independent wildlife consultant. He serves on the boards of several small conservation organizations, and has recently been writing pro bono on the wildlife trade and the spread of zoonotic diseases. And finally, just as you may have thought that we were having a manel today, we are delighted to be joined by Maria Elena Sanchez, who is based in Mexico and is a co-founder and president since 1995 of TAILIS, which is an NGO that is dedicated to investigating and analyzing legal and illegal aspects of wildlife trade, both flora and fauna. Maria Elena worked at the Mexican Environmental Law Enforcement Agency and designed the National CITES Enforcement Program at airports, ports and borders, and the National Enforcement Wild Flora Program for non-timber species. She has been a Mexican delegate at several CITES meetings and is the coordinator of the Latin American and Caribbean Regional Bureau of the Species Survival Network, of which both Humane Society International and Pro Wildlife are founder members. We have about 40 minutes for discussion. Please could we get rid of the screen sharing so we can see everybody on screen at the same time. Because time is actually going to fly by, I'm going to ask our panelists to try to keep their answers as short as possible. If any of you would like to respond to anything that I've asked other panelists, just wave at us and so I can give you the floor. To give the discussion a little bit of structure, I've divided the questions today into three main themes. I'm going to start with the issue of the impact of the trade in stolen wildlife on species conservation and in other countries, and to look a little bit at how smugglers actually operate in the field. Then I want us to move on to discuss CITES and the exotic pet trade more specifically. And then we'd like to finish up with looking at other legal aspects that are associated with this kind of trade, including the question, and this is the burning question today, of whether the panelists think that the EU really does need supplementary legislation to deal with this problem of stolen wildlife. So I think I am going to start with Bruce, if you'd like to unmute yourself. In the bio you sent me, you said that while working at the US Fish and Wildlife Service as a long-term undercover investigations unit, you learned that it was possible to hold 60 live snakes in a bra and a few large lizards in a prosthetic leg. Now, of course, that is very funny, but it's not really a laughing matter when it boils down to it. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about the ways in which animals are taken from the natural habitats and smuggled elsewhere in the world to supply the exotic pet trade.
Oh, thank you very much. First, I just want to thank the hosts and all the participants and the sponsors for allowing me to join this conversation. When I worked for a few years in Fish and Wildlife and the law enforcement unit, we focused on the illegal reptile trade at that time. That was the investigation we were conducting, Operation Chameleon. And I've learned over the years that there's really an infinite variety of way that people smuggle animals. Indeed, there's an infinite variety of way that people smuggle any commodity. While I was working on that investigation, what I noticed was a shift in the way poachers collected animals for the illegal international trade. Particularly in this case, I'm talking about reptiles. And what poachers began to do is they began to target gravid or pregnant adult females, so that when they were successfully smuggled out, In very short order, they could snap their fingers and boom, they say they had captive bred offspring for sale. And of course, by taking these mature adult females from the wild, you're doing the most harm that you could possibly do to a wild population. Unfortunately, many permit issuing authorities around the world, but in Europe in particular, were not asking questions about the origins of parental stock or breeding stock. And as a result, these fairly modest permit issuing standards essentially launder entire lineages of many endangered and critically endangered species into the illegal commercial hobby trade, which of course bleeds over into the zoo trade and even academic holdings of animals. So that's the most disturbing aspect I saw, or the most disturbing shift I saw in the way these animals are traded.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Mark, you have very long experience in herpetological field studies. Could you also give us some examples from your field work where you've seen nationally protected species being targeted for wildlife trafficking, specifically to the EU? You need to go take your mic off.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yes.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for this invitation, a long overdue and important webinar. This should have taken, been started, I think, 10, 20 years ago because it's so urgent and so important. During my field work, mainly in Southeast Asia, and there mainly in Indonesia, which is a mega diversity country, as many of you know, I did in fact have the chance to accompany reptile collectors into the field who targeted protected species that were actually or should only be legally exported as captive breds. But these were wild captured species and specimens of mature size, and they were fed into the trade chains to the EU. So this was even documented by TV to show that laundering takes place in wild captured species. And this is still a big issue today, not only in Indonesia and other countries as well, where what Bruce correctly noted, also today, gravid or pregnant females are collected and their offspring is laundered as captive bred.
Okay, Maria Elena, if you just take your mic off. Mexico is obviously one of the main targets for wildlife trafficking for the European pet trade, and I guess also even more so to the US pet trade. What in general are the species that are most sought after, and what kind of impact do you think that it does have on wild populations in your own region?
Well, of course, thank you for the invitation. This is a great webinar. For starters, Mexico is so far the second country in the world that has more species of reptiles. Many of them are not only endemic, they are micro-endemic. They can be found only in a dot, in a single, very small locality. And that makes them highly vulnerable for any kind of harvest. In the 70s and in 80s and early 90s, yes, the US was the main destination of illegal trade of reptiles and birds and mammals and plants and whatever you can think of. And that's logical, we are neighbors, we have a huge border. But in the recent years, we have been seeing that this illegal trade has been migrating to the EU and also to Asia, but mainly to the EU because they are very organized. They do held a lot of reptile, for instance, just talking about reptiles, reptile fairs in different cities along Europe. And before these fairs, there start to see a lot of advertisement in Facebook, in Twitter, in all kind of social media, and they start gathering requests for certain species or whatever. And based on those requests, they send people to Latin American countries, not only Mexico, it's all Latin American countries, to illegally collect the animals that people are looking for these fairs. So there is no coincidence that some of the seizures that has been taking place in the European Union are prior to these fairs. So we have been in collaboration with pro-wildlife, with the governments of Latin American countries, with special investigators and everything. For instance, some years ago, we were able to capture in Ecuador, the second most important person of a highly organized crime chain, with a suitcase with 13 marine iguanas, newborns from the Galapagos, which are, I mean, iconic and extremely protected, you know? So the thing is that they already have advertised that they did have some newborns that are going to be available at these reptile fairs, but they are not newborns, captive bred. They were wild caught. So the main point that I want you to understand is that for the Latin American countries in general, the budgets for environment protection, for species protection, for law enforcement are very small, are very limited. And I can tell you, for 15 years, maybe 20 years, we have been acting in Latin America in a reactive way. So we have to prepare very quickly a lot of proposals to list species in CITES because we are seeing the high demand and all that kind of stuff. So it's a never-ending story. Even though the countries are making very, very big efforts to protect their own species, the trends are changing constantly, and the demand is every day is going high and high and high. So that demand is diminishing all the efforts that the countries are doing. So I believe that we need to work on enforcement more strongly, but also it is paramount that all the countries work on reducing demand, big campaigns, because otherwise there's not going to be enough armies all around the world to combat illegal wildlife. CITES, I just love CITES. On my view, it's the only international convention that really have teeth, you know? But it's not enough. It's not enough. I mean, we can spend our entire lives putting together proposals and trying to include species on CITES and blah, blah, blah. But we need the participation of all the countries also to honor or to help other countries that are targeted to enforce their own regulations.
We're going to get back to that because I think your perspective on what both John and Sandra had to say will be very interesting. We'll get into a bit. I've just got one more question for you. I mean, you have this, wildlife is clearly being stolen on demand. But what are actually the main routes of smuggling? If you can just give us a really, really short synopsis of how the species are actually smuggled from Mexico to Europe? How's it organized?
Well, they send specialized collectors. There are not amateurs, you know? They are very professional. They go to the field with GPS, especially visiting the locality where the species were described in the first place. So they know exactly where to go. Sometimes they go way ahead and ask local people that are not very aware of the regulations, you know, can you please collect these animals for me? I'll be back in a month or something like that. So they come back, they pay insignificant amount of money and they take the animals. For instance, the last case reported of a seizure in the EU was of Mexican reptiles. Many of them threatened and protected by Mexican law. There's no way there could be any kind of permit for export these animals, the phrenosomas, and they were stuffed inside these typical Mexican dolls, you know. So many of them just suffocate, they died during the transport, and the inspectors just find out about this illegal shipment because the dead animals were starting to smell. So they start to smell, these dolls smell funny, you know? So they start to review these dolls, and they found turtles, alligator lizards recently included in CITES, and also phrenosomas, the horned toads, which are impossible, believe me, because I tried since I was a student at the university. It's basically impossible to keep them in captivity because they need live ants, but certain kind of live ants. So those reptiles, even though they are very resistant, they end dying of starvation. So they also, another method is that they stuff the animals in the documented luggage, inside socks, inside tubes. I mean, you have no idea of, they are all tied up. So the reptiles in general, they are very resistant, and some of them survive this ugly way of transportation. So they already know more or less how many are going to die, so they can keep some profit from these endeavors. So the big problem is also, and I just want to let you know that another trend that we are looking at is on poisonous snakes, especially rattlesnakes. So beware, and please consider the safety of all the inspectors and custom officers all around the world when they have to look into luggages and to packages and everything, that they are going to find rattlesnakes. Do you have the serum to contract?
I think that we have quite a lot of people from customs authorities that have registered for this event. So I think they're going to be able to certainly heed your warning and pass it on. I was wondering, would any of the other panelists like to add anything to this, Jorge or John, from your own experience in implementation, member state experience? Any volunteers? Bruce, okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joe. I just want to speak briefly about the Lacey Act here in the United States. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with it, but it's
Bruce, can I stop you there? We're going to get back to the Lacey Act a bit later.
Sure. Fine.
So I'm going to ask you to hold that thought. And you can talk about it in far more detail because we really want to hear about how it's being implemented. And I think I've seen a few questions coming in from our attendees on this as well. So hold that thought for a second. Okay. Was there anybody else that wanted to say? Mark, you've unmuted. Did you want to add something on the smuggling? You know, I'm presuming it's the same kind of thing from Southeast Asia as well, exactly the same kind of techniques?
Yeah, well, the techniques definitely vary and sometimes are certainly similar to other techniques being conducted in other parts of the world. But regarding the EU, since the EU is the EU and not Europe, this has caused also a lot of cross-border trade, which was uncontrolled. We just have to keep that in mind. Mm-hmm. And we have countries, non-EU countries like Turkey still, which still wants to be a part of the EU at some point, where you have a lot of endemics of vipers, for instance, near the in the Caucasus region, which are really high in demand internationally and also are micro-endemics. So these can basically be transported in cars, and there will be no border controls in search for reptiles following Turkey to Greece. So, you know, these are simple areas, or from Morocco to Spain. We still have imports of land tortoises, well, tortoises from Morocco, which come through Spain to Central Europe. And we still do not know what is going on there really. We know that there's trade going on, but within Europe, we have a lot of problems as well. So this is just a side note looking at this trade as well in a regional context.
And Mark, how do you think that science, you know, you're an expert, you're working in forensic areas of species identification, etc. How do you think that science can contribute to verifying the legality of some of the species that are in trade?
Yeah, well, perhaps one fact that could be highlighted is that there, apart from that, there's a distinct increase in peer-reviewed scientific publications over the last 10, 15 years that clearly identify wildlife trade as a severe threat. Having said this, more and more scientists from different topical areas, subjects are digging deep into this area to publish scientific papers. And let's say about 3 decades ago, the first laboratory for wildlife forensics was set up in the US Fish and Wildlife Service. I think Bruce can also confirm that. And at present, many globally labs are more and more, you know, growing out like mushrooms worldwide, doing forensic genetics on wildlife traded species. And the need to verify legal and illegal trade in endangered and protected species has immensely increased because, as I said, overexploitation is being considered one of the major threats to biodiversity, as has been explicitly stated in many papers, peer-reviewed papers in the past. And since DNA techniques are getting explored more and more and help to enforce wildlife protection laws in place, the term wildlife DNA forensics has been well established today. And at my institution currently, we recently established the FOGS project you introductively mentioned, which is forensic genetics for species protection to develop specific DNA-based tools to combat the illegal trade in protected species. Now, we selected about 200 species at the moment, European and non-European species, and now we need to get samples and to build a reference database to check controls against the reference data and to verify a legal or illegal origin.
Okay, I'm just wondering, because one thing I didn't mention about our MEP host is that he also studied genetics. Martin, maybe you could just weigh in here a little bit to see, you know, is there something you think that we could be working on with regards to the EU Biodiversity Strategy, Wildlife Trafficking Action Plan, using this kind of technology and developing it further?
Definitely. This is something which is now also, thanks to the corona, way more widely available. The PCR test kits, hopefully we will not use the capacity soon anymore in that range, and rather than throw all the machines away, they can be deployed and help us with this tracing. And I think this is, you know, something which we definitely need to look at, how to boost the capacities of the law enforcement, but not only on the side of the not only on the borders themselves. But I think we need to go on one hand to the prevention and to look at the kind of collection, but then really try to be way stronger in and require maybe even genetic passports for the captive bred species. How do we manage them and be stronger in prosecution of the keepers who are simply not following the law? This is something which we need to look at. Not to mention the requirements for keeping such species in general, even if the law is followed. We need clearly a positive list for companion animals.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to get back to that. There's already a question there related to that. Jorge, do you have any thoughts on this? You know, as possibilities for directions we can go in with regards to the Wildlife Trafficking Action Plan, how these kind of things could be included? Could you say just a couple of minutes on that?
Sure, thanks very much, and thank you for the invitation. I think super interesting webinar. I think illegal wildlife trade is definitely very high on our agenda, and as you know, we are in the process of reviewing the EU Wildlife Action Plan, and we plan to update it and to strengthen it in the coming months. And definitely we will have more opportunities to discuss about these matters. I mean, I think that we have to say the EU takes this its responsibility as one of the main traders globally of exotic pets very seriously. In fact, the fact that there are many exotic pets in the CITES list is in many cases due to the steer and to the work that we have done with third countries, with range countries, range states to list and to make proposals to this end. So I think this is something that I would like to highlight. We are dealing with a very pervasive problem, and there is no easy solution. So there is illegal wildlife trafficking, and no matter, in a sense, I think we have to define or design our policies in a sense to make them more effective, more efficient, more easy to enforce. But there will always be unscrupulous traders. There will always be illegal wildlife trade. And there is a need to work with third countries, work with enforcement officers to ensure that this is kept in our customs, in our enforcement agencies on top of the agenda to pursue these criminal activities.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I just wanted to congratulate Sandra and the co-authors, and also the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation for their report, because I think well, I have only been able to read the summary, of course, because the original report is in German, and my German is not good enough to read such a comprehensive report, but I think it's a very valuable contribution because it gives a lot of insights, a lot of information, and we should build on this. But we have to be clear on what our discussion is about. Is it about conservation of biodiversity, or is it about broader sustainability considerations? Is it about ethical. So we want to diminish the demand because we think that trade in exotic pets is per se a problem. We want to tackle illegal trafficking, or we want to tackle a public health pandemic. There are a lot of angles to this discussion, and we are somehow mixing them up. And I think we have to be clear on what we want to pursue with any policy response. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. I just want I need to shift because we've got about 15, 20 minutes for the rest of this discussion. As I say, time flies. Sandra, what kind of responses have you had to the stolen wildlife reports from the range states so far? You need to unmute. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we learned that in most cases, the range states that we informed about our findings were not even aware that their wildlife, which is nationally protected against capture and export, is at all sold at the European pet market. And these range states were very thankful for our information and looked for options to stop the plundering. And in reply to our stolen wildlife report, some dozen species have already been listed in CITES Appendix 2 or even Appendix 1, such as the alligator lizards from Latin America, psychedelic gecko from Vietnam, or vipers from Kenya and from Iran. And some of these proposals were also supported by the European Union. And as the process of, but I mean, we are just talking about some dozens of species now covered, and the problem is much bigger. And as the process for listing in CITES Appendices 1 and 2 is pretty slow, with the COP only held every 3 years, Cuba, Sri Lanka, and Japan just recently requested the listing of a bunch of their nationally protected species in CITES Appendix 3, which is an easier and quicker process, but with weaker enforcement. So with a limited range of effect.
So you don't see that CITES Appendix 3 is necessarily the best tool to combat this situation?
I think CITES Appendix 3 is an interim solution. And as such, it's a valuable tool as it highlights the fact that the country is, is concerned about the trade in its nationally protected species. But 3 problems remain to be unsolved: awareness, capacities, and sanctions.
Okay.
Awareness is that, as I said, the range states are often not even aware of what's going on with their species. And even in the IUCN Red List assessments, in many cases, there's not at all information on trade in this species, or it's stated there is no trade, but we find these animals in trade. So there's a clear underestimation of what's going on. The second point is the capacities. Several range states with strict national legislation are among the biodiversity hotspots, such as Maria Elena said, for example, with Mexico. And these countries are home to thousands of species that could be of interest or are already in the exotic pet trade. Just look at Brazil, Mexico, Sri Lanka, Australia. And in case these countries would list all their nationally protected species in Appendix 3, we will get a very long list. And the third thing is the sanctions, which is, as a European citizen, I'm really worried about that, because at present, the EU neither prohibits nor imposes penalties for the sale, purchase, and ownership of illegally sourced animals listed in CITES Appendix 3. Only the imports or exports of Appendix 3 animals in illegal cases can be penalized. So that's not enough from our point of view.
So for the next MEPs for Wildlife meeting is most likely going to be on the Environmental Crime Directive. We will also be addressing this issue of premises for wildlife trafficking. Can I just go to you, John? You know, you spent many years working at CITES as the Secretary General. Can you confirm that the impact of the international exotic pet trade has actually gained an increasing role in the last 10 to 15 years? And if so, what were the reasons for that?
Thanks for that. Thanks for moderating this good Q&A. The EU actually, through its commission, hosted an event while I was Secretary General on issues to do with the pet trade. Sandra, I think you were there from recollection. Jorge, I think you were there. I can't recall whether you were in this role at that stage or not. But there was a big round table. A lot of people from the pet industry were there. A lot of people from NGOs and also the relevant officials from the European Commission. And that was triggered by the Commission. That was a very good discussion, and it was held because of a recognition of the increasing scale and impact of pet trade. You tend to have a lot of small players in this space. You haven't got an industry association that's effective as one finds in other sectors. And you've got lots of different aspects to it. So I think there's a recognition within the European Union of this. Certainly I saw it as CITES Secretary General. Sometimes this trade wasn't taken as seriously as other trade. Appendix 3 in some countries wasn't taken seriously, in particular in countries where it was dealt with at a subnational level. They tended to disregard Appendix 3. The whole issue of identification is a big one. I think Bruce will probably talk about that, and I think Mark spoke about that. So how do you identify a species that's listed or unlisted? How do you determine whether a particular animal is captively bred or wild taken? One can use modern forensics to try and deal with some of these issues. But there are a lot of challenges there. One of the issues CITES has been blind to as well is the animal health impacts at destination countries, in particular if you're trading in amphibians. Bruce, one of your former colleagues, I think from Fish and Wildlife Service, Jonathan Colby has been active in writing on this, that people may trade something as a pet. It comes from source to destination, quite legally, quite often, gets released into the wild. It has devastating impact, but that's not really being addressed. The focus is on the source, not on what might happen at the destination, and one can say the same for human health. So I'd say this is still an area, this whole issue of pet trade is one that's still developing, evolving. The response is still having to catch up a little bit with the scale and nature of the trade. And as Sandra just said, then you can't put under CITES every species that a country seeks to protect at national level. I grew up in Australia. It had very strict laws on taking any wildlife, either for domestic or international trade. But what we should do is have a protocol, as I was describing in my intervention, that respects national laws. You should not be able to steal wildlife from a country, whether it's listed under CITES or not. You shouldn't steal it. And if you steal it and you get it out of the source country, you should be facing criminal prosecution in the destination country if you get caught. So if you are in France or Belgium or Romania or anywhere else in the European Union and you manage to smuggle something out of Gabon that's not listed under CITES, or even if it is listed under CITES or not, if you manage to get out of Gabon, you should face a criminal prosecution at the destination end, and put more emphasis on destination states stepping up and criminalizing bringing in wildlife that's been stolen from source countries where it's protected under their national laws. Respect the national laws of source countries.
Thank you, John. That's a very, very strong message. I'm going to hand over to Jorge now, partly to respond to that, but also because I'm just going to go now into the other kind of legal aspects. Only about 25% of the EU wildlife imports are actually covered by the EU wildlife trade regulations. That's whether it's, in legal trade or stolen wildlife. Bearing this in mind, Does the EU actually take, and is it planning to take any steps to at least monitor and register wildlife imports for unprotected species? I mean, you know, when you look at the figures on Eurostat, you only just see basically a few species categories, and that's it, nothing really at the individual species level. So we have no idea kind of what are the volumes and the species that are actually involved in this, unless we're looking at the kind of research that Sandra and her colleagues have been doing. Do you think it's possible to set up some kind of monitoring system and registration system for wildlife imports?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. I think, well, as I said, we will have the opportunity to have a discussion on possible responses to the situation in the view of the review of the Wildlife Action Plan, and certainly this is an area where we are open to hear proposals, because indeed for those species that are not listed in CITES, there is a record, there is a reporting, but it is not always matching the expectations or what we would need to have proper information. That's the feedback that I got from already a number of stakeholders, and we are happy to look into that in the context of the review of the Wildlife Action Plan. Having said that, the fact, and I come back to my first intervention, the fact that there is trade, it doesn't say per se that there is a problem unless we believe that there is a problem, that there is the trade. So we come back to the objectives. If there is trade, it doesn't mean that this trade is impacting conservation. If there is trade, there is not, it doesn't mean that it's against the laws of the country of origin. So what is the objective that what we want to address here? Is a conservation issue. So it's clear that there is significant trade in exotic pets, but this doesn't say much about conservation per se. There are examples, and you have given clear examples of cases where it would be impossible to trade this legally because of the rules of the country of origin. But I come to the question of what a solution, an effective solution to that problem would be. And this is where I think we have to have a reflection when you as moderator would like to allow me for that.
Okay. Okay. Bruce, I'd like to ask you, it's been reported that due to a lack of EU legislation, illegally caught wildlife is regularly laundered through the EU, actually to finally enter the US market as captured bred in order to avoid the sanctions relating to the Lacey Act. Can you confirm those kind of reports from your practical experience as a former officer of US Fish and Wildlife Service? And perhaps this is now your opportunity to say more about the Lacey Act.
Thank you very much, Joe. I want to thank John Scanlon for his very important and helpful comments earlier about the importance of holding national citizens responsible when they are violating the wildlife laws of other countries by importing animals. And I think I would mention to Jorge that the United States, in processing applications for CITES permits for many years, has looked at founder stock and parental stock before issuing permits. And it's been a fairly smooth process. It's rarely been challenged, and when challenged, Fish and Wildlife decisions have been upheld on appeal. So I think there's definitely a lot of room to strengthen systems. I would point out that nationally in today's world, if you're not discouraging illegal trade, you're really laying out the invitation mat for it to enter your country. In the US, we have a divided, as everybody probably knows, we have a divided federal and state constitutional system. So in some ways, it's quite comparable to the European Union. It's a group of individual actors with a central organizing and governing system. The Lacey Act, which is a very old law regulating wildlife trade, was specifically designed and intended to shepherd these different government actors into a single unifying legal standard. Critically, the Lacey Act allows the US to be a responsible actor on the international stage, as it allows authorities here to support the conservation aspirations and laws of less developed countries. And it ensures that Americans are to some degree dissuaded from the illegal exploitation of foreign countries' animal and plant resources. A similar system seems not only necessary, but ideal for the EU, in my humble opinion.
Thank you. So yeah, actually, I'd like to actually get Jorge's response to that. But I was also wondering. I mean, we have a precedent in EU legislation, which is the Flecht regulation, which is basically to do with preventing the illegal and unsustainable trade in timber. So, from our perspective, wouldn't that have the same kind of function as a Lacey Act for species of wildlife and actually even plants? Do you think that's a way in which we could actually protect species from illegal capture and export from range states?
Thank you. Let me just comment on the issue of captive breeding, because I think we have in the EU legislation that is stricter than CITES. We are actually implementing it in a very strict manner, and we often come back to third countries and to importers and in gathering new additional information on the founder stock. We hosted a couple of years ago a workshop, a discussion on legality of this. We are in a process of finalizing a guidance that will reinforce significantly the implementation of this in the EU, but we have already quite high standards. I have to say, if not the highest in the world, there would be among the highest in the world. And actually, this is causing us some troubles with third countries when we are asking many questions about the origin, the legal origin of these captive breeding stocks. Just to respond to your question, I think we have to also bear in mind that the responses to this problem have to be tailored to the problem that we want to address. We have, you are probably referring to the EU timber regulation, where we have a system. We have a regulation, a EU-wide regulation, that prohibits the placing on the EU market of timber that has been illegally harvested, and includes a due diligence obligation for any operator that places timber on the EU market. We are in the process at the moment of reviewing or evaluating the effectiveness of this regulation. And actually, one of the concerns that we have when we hear about the Lacey Act is our experience on the EU timber regulation. Being conscious that it's quite different, because the EU timber regulation puts an obligation of due diligence with a definition of negligible risk. So in fact, the EU authorities could take operators to court on the basis of them not respecting the obligation of due diligence and not ensuring that the risk is negligible, being a very blurred concept, this negligible risk. If I understand correctly, Lacey Act relies completely on the breach of third country legislation, and this poses quite some enforcement challenges. And in fact, in our contacts with the US authorities in the past, we have they have expressed the difficulties, and the statistics talk by themselves, of enforcing such a legislation in the US. It is difficult to prove a breach of a law of a third country. And I mean, I can go into examples, but this also links with the experience we have with the timber regulation that we are evaluating at the moment. Just to say, for example, that the Lacey Act included timber and plant species in 2008. And as far as we know, the first conviction under the Lacey Act for timber was in 2016. So talking about the slow processes, we have also to reflect that there might not be magic solutions and very fast solutions. So I think we may want to reflect on better using and improving the mechanisms that we have in place, which some of them, and some of them have been mentioned as Appendix 3 of CITES, are very quick and might not have the same impact as some other listings or some other tools, but they are quite interesting as a first quick step to gather information that currently we don't have systematically. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have 10 minutes left. I wanted to give the floor to the other panelists in order to have them an opportunity to respond to some of this, but that will mean that it will be at the expense of the Q&A, the questions that have come from the public, unless you guys don't object to staying for another 5 minutes or so. Martin, is that a problem for you?
I will have to be running latest around 16:40.
Okay. Well, if we just stretch 5 more minutes before your concluding remarks, then maybe we can fit in at least a couple of questions. Could I ask, and really, you know, no longer than 30 seconds, if anybody else wants to weigh in on this? I saw Mary-Elena was waving her hand. So could you say something very, and Sandra, some very, very briefly? And John, okay.
Well, thank you, Joe. I just want to make a point for everybody to keep in mind. I do have some experience on the enforcement of CITES and the enforcement of environmental regulations. And it is basically impossible to ascertain or to evaluate which is the effectiveness of the enforcement equipment, enforcement branch, or enforcement force in a country. In order to do that, you need to first have a very accurate estimation of the universe of the illegal trade you are talking about. And based on that estimation, which is very, very hard to have, really, you can compare that with the percentage of success of how many hits or how many seizures the enforcement authority is doing. So just to give you an example, we did that only on parrots in Mexico, only on 22 species of parrots in Mexico. And we were able, after a lot of investigation, to have an estimation of the universe of illegal trade in Mexico. And the efficiency of the law, environmental law enforcement in Mexico was only 2%. In the US, some evaluation have been made during the years, and they can reach 4%. Okay, I don't know about the EU, but I imagine that if I am very generous, you can reach 10% of detection of illegal shipments.
So it's basically a tip of the iceberg.
So when you look at a seizure of 2,000 or 3,000 or 30,000 reptiles, just consider at best that is the 10% of the universe of illegal trade, just to keep that in mind.
And the mortality also involved in the life which is ending up at the end user. John and Sandra, I'd say ladies first maybe, but keep it really short.
I'll try. Okay. I just want to reply to what Jorge said, because he asked what we are talking about. I mean, you are right that trade is not per se necessarily a conservation problem, but at present, the burden of proof is on the side of conservation that this trade is sustainable, and which is not at all precautionary. And the EU is bound to a precautionary approach by its treaty. And from our point of view, many problems would be solved if instead a paradigm shift would be realized, a reversal to the status quo, to put the burden of proof that trade is not negatively affecting the wild populations, is put on the side of those who benefit from the trade. That would be kind of our dream, but of course we are not, this is not the reality so far, and that's why we are trying to focus on this legal aspect with the Lazy Act, for example.
John.
Great, thanks very much. In response to Jorge as well, I think that what we're talking about is trade has a conservation of public health and an animal health aspect, as well as certain other aspects, including welfare issues. But underlying this discussion has been one of legality, and one ought to be able to establish legal origin, whether a species is listed under CITES or is protected under national law. And this is about comity. This is about showing respect for the national laws of source countries. I don't think anyone's suggesting that the EU ought just pick up the Lazy Act and adopt it. I think what the conversation's been around is some of the underlying principles that underpinned the Lazy Act. From our perspective, we're looking at an international convention that can pick up issues to do with how we address illicit wildlife trafficking in the way in which I've described. If I can just make one final remark. We've been at this for 50 years. We're seeing illicit wildlife trafficking increase, not just for listed species, but for unlisted species. The IPBES report of 2019 was very clear. It's not time for incremental change, it's time for transformational change. And either we're going to bite the bullet and really recognize the scale and nature and consequences of this illicit wildlife trafficking and have a real hard crack at stopping it, or we're just going to keep doing the same little incrementalism that we've been doing for many years now and has not got us to where we need to be. So let's pay attention to what the IPBES Global Assessment said in 2019. Now's the time for transformational change.
That's probably a very good thought to end on. We really have run out of time, I think, for most questions. I'm going to just put one question forward, which has actually come in from various different people, relating to, and also something that Martin mentioned, as relating to the idea of having an EU positive list for the pet trade. I mean, we know we're in the middle of a global pandemic. Experts have shown that, exotic pet trade is also a risk. Other problems like, introduction of invasive alien species, etc., animal welfare. So the question that Ilaria De Silvestre from Eurogroup and a number of others have basically asked is, do you think it's time for the EU to show that the lesson has been learned and to switch from a reactive to a proactive model, adopted preventative measures that strictly regulate the exotic pet trade through the adoption of positive list of allowed pet species, as has already been done in 5 member states? I know this is a subject for a whole other meeting, but maybe some closing thoughts. Maybe Martin, that's something you'd like to close the meeting on.
But this is a simple answer: yes. But we need to look. I think we need to go. We need this. I think we need this as a part of the approach. We need to then have a system for the legitimate keepers of reptiles and other species, which will allow them to do it in a good way, and at the same time, I think we need to bring the community of people who keep these animals and are trying to do the right thing on our side, because they are also often then suffering, and we need to figure out how to together prevent this really also cruel trade. Let's be honest, this is also about animal welfare. And I agree, we have a unique moment, not only from a political point of view, but one would hope that we really, as a civilization, start learning lessons from these pandemics. And this needs to be one of the lessons, in my view, that we learned. And I'm very happy that I saw Saskia in the chat, who is the rapporteur in the Inter committee on these issues. And we'll need to look at it from the trade treaties perspectives as well. We will need to look at it from the perspective of collaboration on the European level, because I believe that jointly we can be way more efficient and therefore have a bigger impact with fewer resources. And we should not end with action plans, statements, strategies, but we really need to see binding rules and action on the ground, and also assistance to the countries which are having much harder time, especially among the least developed countries, which, you know, we're telling them to protect the biodiversity, but we need to help them to do that. I think it's our duty. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Martin, so much, and thank you so much again for hosting this event. I would like to thank all of the speakers who've joined us from different parts of the world, all with great expertise on this issue. There have been a bunch of questions that have come through. We're going to see if we can get some of those, you guys, to answer them if they've been specifically directed to you, to circle back to some of the attendees. There's never enough time in these discussions. I think I will now, thank everybody once again and close this meeting, and let you all know that the next MEPs for Wildlife meeting is likely to be on the Environmental Crime Directive, and I think we have a date of the 16th of March. So, please join us again. This is a fantastic forum in order to really be able to discuss a lot of the issues that are of great concern to both MEPs, but also to NGOs and other stakeholders. So thank you once again, and I will hereby close this meeting. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.